Fluorescent lights buzz like dying wasps in the ceiling of St. Jude's emergency room. Rachel presses 2 fingers against a patient's clammy neck, counting a thready pulse, praying for the end of her shift. She came here to forget how to kill. Tonight she'll have to remember. Tuesdays at 3:14 ACOM M belong to the ghosts and the deeply unlucky. The air in the trauma bay always smelled the same at this hour, a suffocating mix of industrial lemon bleach, stale coffee from the break room, and the sharp, hot penny stench of ruptured veins. Rachel Cole leaned against the edge of the nurse's station, rolling a crick out of her neck. Her lower back throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache that synchronized with the squeak of Dr. Aaron Hayes's rubber-soled clogs as he paced behind her. Aaron was 28, fresh out of residency, and still possessed a naive, frantic energy that exhausted Rachel just to look at. He was currently chewing on his thumbnail, staring at the empty double doors of the ambulance bay. "Dispatch said 3 minutes," Aaron muttered, checking his watch for the 4th time. "Gunshot to the chest. Tachycardic. BP is tanking." Rachel didn't look up from her clipboard. She was meticulously writing down inventory numbers for IV bags. "Then we'll run saline wide open and prep for a chest tube, doctor. Pacing a hole in the linoleum won't make the rig drive faster." She smoothed a wrinkle in her stiff blue scrubs. Rachel was 42, though the harsh overhead lighting carved deep shadows under her eyes, making her look older. Her hands were her most betraying feature. While the other nurses had soft skin that smelled of vanilla lotion, Rachel's hands were mapped with pale, fine scars, her knuckles thick, her fingernails cut ruthlessly short. The double doors crashed open. The quiet of the ER shattered instantly. 2 paramedics sprinted through, pushing a gurney that rattled violently over the metal floor threshold. The man on the stretcher was convulsing weakly, his chest a mess of torn fabric and dark, wet crimson. "John Doe found in an alley off 4th?" The lead medic shouted, breathless. "Single GSW to the right upper thorax. Lost a lot of volume. We got 118 gauge line in running fluids, but his veins are collapsing." "Bay 1 now!" Aaron barked, finally snapping into his element. Rachel moved before the command was finished. The lethargy of the 3 a.m. slump evaporated. This was the only part of the job that made sense to her anymore, the mechanics of saving a life. It was a math equation. Fluid out meant fluid in. Pressure dropping meant finding the leak. She snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves, the tight latex biting into her wrists. As the gurney locked into place under the blinding surgical lights, Rachel took a pair of heavy trauma shears and began cutting the man's shirt away. The fabric resisted. She frowned, applying more pressure. It wasn't cheap cotton. It was a tight synthetic ballistic weave. She peeled the ruined shirt back, exposing the pale, clammy skin of the patient's chest. The entry wound was small, a neat, puckered hole just below the clavicle. But when Rachel rolled him slightly to stick a cardiac monitor pad to his flank, she felt the exit wound. Her fingers slipped into a massive, jagged crater near his scapula. High velocity her brain registered automatically. Armor piercing. 5.56 millimeter. Not a gangbanger's cheap handgun. She looked at the man's face. Mid-30s. Short, military-style haircut. Unconscious, his jaw slack. But as she reached down to unbuckle his thick canvas belt to check for lower body trauma, his hand suddenly shot up. His fingers clamped around Rachel's wrist. The grip was staggering, bone-crushing. Aaron yelped, stepping back. The patient's eyes cracked open. The pupils were blown wide, swimming in shock, but they locked onto Rachel with a terrifying, lucid intensity. "House is burning!" He wheezed blood, bubbling at the corner of his cracked lips. "House is burning!" Rachel's stomach dropped. The ambient noise of the room, the rapid, panicked beeping of the heart monitor, Aaron shouting for a unit of O negative, The hiss of the oxygen valve seemed to mute. House is burning. It was an old phrase. A private military contractor code for a compromised location. A wipeout protocol. She stared down at the man. She noticed the thick calluses on the inside of his right index finger, the trigger finger. She noticed the faint, faded ink of a specialized unit insignia barely visible under the edge of his collar. "Let go," Rachel said softly, leaning in close. She pressed her thumb hard into a nerve cluster on his forearm. His grip failed instantly, his hand dropping back to the gurney as he lost consciousness again. "What did he say?" Aaron asked, his hands shaking as he prepped a syringe of fentanyl. "Delirious." Rachel lied smoothly. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a cold, familiar spike of adrenaline flooding her system. It tasted like ash in the back of her throat. While Aaron was distracted, looking at the monitor, Rachel quickly ran her hands over the patient's cargo pants. Deep in the right side pocket, her fingers brushed against hard, cold ceramic. She slid it out, a sleek, non-metallic, fixed-blade knife designed to pass through metal detectors. Without breaking her rhythm, she slipped the blade into the deep pocket of her own scrubs. "Get the chest tube tray," Aaron ordered, oblivious. "He's bleeding into the pleural cavity." Rachel nodded, turning toward the supply cart. Her hands were perfectly steady, but internally the carefully constructed walls of the life she had built over the last 5 years were crumbling. People who got shot with armor-piercing rounds and mumbled extraction codes didn't just get dropped off at a civilian hospital by accident. They were followed. Stable, intubated, and chemically sedated, the mysterious patient finally rested in the dim glow of Bay 4 by 4:15 a.m. Adrenaline from the trauma burned off, leaving the emergency room staff in a hollow, exhausted stupor. Aaron sat at the main computer terminal, aggressively typing his notes, sighing heavily into the quiet room. At the triage desk near the front entrance, Patty, a nurse 6 months from retirement, scratched away at a crossword puzzle. Rachel stood in the break room, clutching a styrofoam cup of black coffee that tasted faintly of burnt plastic. Overhead, a fluorescent tube flickered, casting erratic shadows across the scuffed linoleum. Staring at her reflection in the darkened window overlooking the ambulance bay, she noted the deep bags hanging under her eyes. She wanted nothing more than to be just a tired nurse. She wanted to complain about her aching feet, go home to her empty apartment, feed her indifferent cat, and sleep. Reaching into her pocket, her fingertips traced the smooth handle of the ceramic blade she had confiscated from the patient. Paranoia, she told herself. You left that life in Bogota. You're a civilian now. Then the ambient pressure in the building shifted. Heavy automated double doors at the main entrance slid open, letting in a sudden rush of humid summer air. Rachel turned her head. Through the narrow window of the break room door, she had a clear line of sight to the triage desk. 2 men walked in. Wearing navy blue uniforms of a private ambulance company, they carried a collapsible stretcher between them. To anyone else, they were just another transport crew on the graveyard shift. Rachel's eyes tracked their movements, her brain processing the data with brutal efficiency. Their center of gravity was too low. They lacked the slouching, exhausted posture of paramedics working at 4 in the morning. Their eyes were active, sweeping the corners of the room, registering the camera placements, and their footwear, instead of standard-issue, slip-resistant hospital shoes, they wore tactical boots laced tight, the rubber squeaking faintly against the floor. Setting her coffee cup down, Rachel felt her hand trembling. Not from bravery, but from a deep, nauseating surge of terror. A violent spasm seized her stomach, and she tasted bitter bile. She had promised herself she would never be in a room smelling of cordite and copper ever again. At the triage desk, Patty looked up, adjusting her reading glasses. "Can I help you, boys? We don't have any transfers scheduled." Smiling a dead, empty expression, the lead man reached beneath the blanket on the empty stretcher. When his hand came back up, It held a compact matte black pistol with a cylindrical suppressor threaded to the barrel. Phoot. Shockingly quiet, the sound resembled a wet, compressed spit of air. Patty's head snapped back. Her glasses flew off her face, clattering onto the floor. Slumping forward, she hit the desk, smearing dark crimson across her crossword puzzle. Rachel clamped a hand over her own mouth, pressing her back against the break room wall. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. The primitive part of her brain screamed at her to run. The fire exit was 10 feet away. She could slip out, disappear into the alley, and keep moving. The hospital didn't pay her enough to die. Taking a step toward the exit, she hesitated and looked back through the window. Down the hall past the triage desk, Aaron walked out of Bay 4 holding a fresh IV bag, entirely unaware of the corpse at the front desk. "Hey, Patty, did pharmacy send up the—" Aaron froze in the middle of the corridor. Both men snapped their weapons up, aiming down the hall. Rachel didn't think. The civilized veneer she had painted over herself for 5 years instantly shattered. Muscle memory drilled into her over a decade of surviving in places that didn't exist on official maps, violently took the wheel. Dropping to her hands and knees, she ignored the sharp pain in her bad back and crawled out of the break room, keeping below the level of the frosted glass partition. The floor was sticky, smelling faintly of spilled apple juice and heavy-duty floor wax. Heavy, deliberate treads moved down the hall toward Aaron. "Where is the gunshot victim?" One of the men asked, his voice calm, conversational, carrying a slight Eastern European lilt. Paralyzed Aaron stared at the suppressed guns, his mouth opening and closing silently. He dropped the IV bag. It ruptured on the floor, splashing saline over his clogs. Reaching the corner of the trauma bay corridor, Rachel found herself behind the second man. She needed a weapon. The ceramic blade was too short for a primary strike against men likely wearing soft armor. Her hand scrambled over a medical cart parked against the wall, finding the heavy, cold steel of an oxygen D cylinder. It weighed about 10 pounds. "I asked you a question, Doctor," the first man said, stepping closer to Aaron and raising the pistol to his face. Rachel lunged. No screams, no sound. She swung the heavy oxygen tank in a brutal, two-handed arc, aiming not for the head, but for the back of the second man's knee. Heavy metal connected with a sickening crack. The joint gave way instantly. The man collapsed with a grunt of surprise, his leg folding entirely backward. Using his back as a springboard, Rachel launched herself at the lead killer. Spinning toward her, his eyes widening, the man brought the pistol around. Rachel grabbed the barrel with her left hand, violently twisting it upward, away from her center mass. The weapon discharged phut, blowing a hole in the ceiling tiles and raining white plaster dust down on them. Heat from the silencer instantly blistered the skin on Rachel's palm. The smell of burning flesh and ozone filled the sterile air. Ignoring the agonizing pain, she dug her right hand into her scrub pocket, produced the ceramic blade, and drove it upward under the man's jawline, deep into the soft tissue of his throat. It was desperate, messy, and exhausted. They crashed to the floor together, tangling in the privacy curtain of Bay, 3 pulling down a tray of surgical instruments that clattered loudly against the tiles. Thrashing wildly, his heavy boots kicking into Rachel's ribs and knocking the wind out of her. The man let go of the gun. His hands flew to his ruined throat, trying to stem the arterial spray, painting the blue curtain a slick dark red. The smell of hot, fresh iron was overpowering. Scrambling backward, gasping for air, Rachel slipped on the slick floor, but snatched up the dropped pistol. Her burned left hand screamed in protest as she locked her grip, checking the chamber with a sharp rack of the slide. Turning back to the first man, she saw him propped up on his elbows, reaching desperately under his uniform jacket for a backup weapon. Rachel didn't hesitate. She didn't warn him. Raising the stolen pistol, she pulled the trigger twice. Phut, phut. Slumping back against the wall, 2 neat holes in his chest, the man stared blankly at the fluorescent lights. Silence slammed back into the ER, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor in Bay 4. Sitting on the floor, leaning against the cold wall, Rachel's chest heaved. Her scrubs were soaked in fluid that wasn't hers. Her left hand was blistered and raw. She felt old. She felt incredibly profoundly tired. Slowly, Aaron crept out from behind the doorframe of Bay 4. Trembling violently, his face the color of wet chalk, he looked at the dead men. Finally, his wide, terrified eyes landed on Rachel. He stared at the way she held the gun, perfectly leveled finger off the trigger resting on the slide, the stance of a professional. Rachel. Aaron's voice cracked a high, thin sound of pure disbelief. What did you just do? Wiping a smear of damp hair off her forehead with the back of her forearm, she looked at the terrified doctor. I clocked out Aaron, she whispered, her voice rough. She pushed herself up from the floor joints, popping. And you need to get away from the windows. Static popped sharply from the dead man's ear. Rachel crouched beside the body, her bad knee loudly cracking in the quiet hallway. She grimaced, ignoring the sharp twinge in her lower lumbar, and pinched the tiny black earpiece from the assassin's ear canal. It was slick with sweat. Disgust churned in her empty stomach, but she pressed the plastic nub against her own ear. Entry team status. The voice over the comms was heavy with a flat, Midwestern accent. We heard a discharge. Give me a sitrep. Rachel didn't breathe. She placed the earpiece on the floor and brought the heel of her tactical boot down on it, grinding the electronics into plastic splinters. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. That was all the time they had before the voice on the radio realized his entry team was dead and sent the rest of the pack inside. She turned to Aaron. The young doctor was leaning heavily against the supply cart, dry heaving into a blue biohazard bin. His perfectly gelled hair was a mess. Aaron, Rachel said. Her voice was raspy dry as cracked earth. He didn't look up. He just kept making horrible, wet, choking sounds. Rachel walked over, grabbed a fistful of his pristine scrub top, and slammed him back against the wall. The impact rattled the plastic bins on the cart. Aaron gasped, his eyes wide and leaking tears. Listen to me, Rachel said, keeping her tone brutally level. I know you want to fall apart. You have every right to. But if you don't help me move that patient right now, men with very quiet guns are going to come through those doors and put a bullet in your head just for being in the same room as me. Do you understand? Aaron blinked. A drop of sweat rolled down his pale nose. You killed them. Rachel, you just... I know what I did. The words tasted like bile. She hated the weight of the gun in her hand. She hated the familiar, cold calculus currently running through her brain. Now grab the portable monitor. We're moving. Moving a critical patient on life support is not a graceful tactical maneuver. It is a loud, clumsy, miserable chore. The gurney's front left wheel had a flat spot, vibrating loudly as Rachel and Aaron shoved it down the hallway. Where are we going? Aaron whispered frantically, clutching the portable heart monitor to his chest like a shield. Cables trailed dangerously close to the gurney's wheels. Radiology. Rachel grunted. She leaned her weight into the heavy bed, feeling the muscles in her unburned arm straining. Heavy doors, lead-lined walls, and only one way in. They pushed the unconscious man past the pediatric waiting area. The cheerful murals of cartoon giraffes and monkeys mocked the dark streaks of blood Rachel was leaving on the handrails. Her left palm was a blistered, agonizing mess. Every time her heart beat, a fresh wave of fire radiated up to her elbow. She had hastily wrapped it in a layer of sterile gauze and medical tape, but it was already soaking through with clear fluid. Clang. Down the hall near the ambulance bay, the heavy metal security doors groaned open. The distinct squeak of rubber soles on linoleum echoed through the empty corridors. "Go, go, go!" Rachel hissed, shoving the gurney around the corner toward the imaging wing. They reached the heavy reinforced door of the MRI suite. Aaron fumbled with his keycard, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice. "Swipe it!" Rachel snapped, raising the stolen pistol. She aimed down the dark corridor they had just fled. Shadows moved near the cafeteria intersection. 2, maybe 3 figures. The card reader beeped cheerfully. Green light. Rachel grabbed the back of Aaron's collar and practically threw him into the room, shoving the gurney in right behind him. She slammed the heavy lid-lined door shut and threw the manual deadbolt. The lock engaged with a solid, reassuring thunk. Total darkness enveloped them. "Don't turn on the overheads," Rachel whispered, feeling along the wall. She found the switch for the low-level observation lights. A dim amber glow illuminated the control room. Through the thick glass partition, the massive donut-shaped MRI machine loomed in the center of the scanning room like a sleeping white beast. Aaron collapsed into a rolling desk chair, burying his face in his hands. He was sobbing now, quiet, pathetic gasps. Rachel ignored him. She walked over to the patient. David Miller, that was the name on the driver's license she had pulled from his wallet while they were moving. The monitor showed his vitals were holding, but just barely. His oxygen saturation was dipping. "He needs to be bagged," Rachel said, turning back to the doctor. "Aaron, look at me." Aaron squeezed his eyes shut. Rachel walked over and kicked the leg of his chair. Hard. "He is hypoxic. Bag him or he dies right here, and all of this was for nothing." The doctor looked up, his face a portrait of utter terror. But the command breached his panic. It was a medical order. He understood those. Trembling, he stood up, moved to the head of the gurney, and began rhythmically squeezing the ambu bag, forcing air into David's damaged lungs. Rachel backed away, pressing her shoulders against the cold wall. She looked at her ruined hand. She looked at the gun in her right hand. She had promised herself she was done. When she left the extraction team in Bogotá, when she scrubbed her identity and forged nursing credentials, she thought she could wash the violence out of her clothes. She closed her eyes. The distinct metallic clink of a heavy tool against the suite's door lock echoed through the room. They were here. Heavy impacts began hitting the reinforced door. Rhythmic. Brutal. They were using a breaching ram. The heavy lead-lined door shuddered dust falling from the door frame. Rachel looked around the cramped control room. The walls were thick, but the door wouldn't hold forever against a dedicated entry team. She needed a choke point. She needed an advantage. Her eyes landed on the warning signs plastered across the glass partition leading into the actual scanning room. Warning: strong magnetic field. No pacemakers. No metallic objects. An ugly, cynical idea bloomed in her chest. "Aaron," Rachel said, moving quickly. "Push the gurney into the far corner of the control room. Get behind the server racks." "What are you doing?" he squeaked, dragging the heavy bed backward. Rachel didn't answer. She walked to the main terminal of the MRI console. The machine was currently in standby mode, its magnetic field idling at a safe level for maintenance. She typed her override credentials into the keyboard, ignoring the pain in her burned hand as her fingers hit the keys. She initiated an emergency quench override. She didn't trigger the actual helium release that would suffocate everyone in the room, but she bypassed the safety limits, spooling the massive electromagnet up to its absolute maximum Tesla capacity. A deep, bone-rattling hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. The hair on Rachel's arms stood on end. She walked over to the heavy glass partition door leading into the scanning room. She opened it wide, propping it with a heavy medical text. The outer door to the hallway buckled inward with a horrific screech of tearing metal. The upper hinge snapped. Rachel backed into the scanning room, standing right in front of the massive white tube. She set her stolen pistol down on the floor outside the magnetic perimeter, taking only her ceramic blade. She took a deep breath, the air tasting sharply of metallic ozone. The outer door finally gave way. It crashed inward, taking a chunk of the drywall with it. 3 men poured into the control room. They moved with terrifying synchronization rifles, raised laser sights cutting red arcs through the dim amber light. Clear right, clear left. They ignored Aaron cowering behind the server racks in the corner, immediately locking their sights on Rachel standing alone inside the scanning room. Target acquired, the lead man barked, stepping through the glass partition doorway, raising his customized assault rifle. Rachel didn't flinch. She just waited for him to cross the threshold. The moment the lead assassin stepped fully into the room, the raw, unrestricted power of the 3 Tesla magnet grabbed him. It wasn't a gentle pull, it was violent, unstoppable physics. The heavy steel rifle in his hands was ripped forward with the force of a speeding truck. The weapon slammed into the plastic housing of the MRI tube with a deafening crash. The man didn't let go of the rifle in time. His momentum carried him forward, his chest slamming brutally into the side of the machine, his tactical vest laced with steel trauma plates, pinning him against the immense magnet like a helpless insect on a windshield. He screamed as his ribs cracked under the immense pressure. The second man, realizing the trap too late, tried to backpedal, but he was already too close. The magazines on his belt, his sidearm, the buckles of his gear, all of it betrayed him. He was dragged off his feet, flying sideways across the room. His helmet slammed into the edge of the machine, dropping him instantly unconscious. The third man, still standing in the doorway, had the presence of mind to drop his weapon. He let his rifle clatter to the floor and reached for a ceramic combat knife strapped to his thigh, entirely unaffected by the magnet. He lunged at Rachel. Rachel caught his arm, parrying his thrust. She was exhausted, her body aching, her left hand practically useless. The man was heavier, faster, and uninjured. He slammed her backward into the wall. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. He pinned her right arm against the drywall, raising his knife to drive it down into her neck. Rachel looked up into his cold, professional eyes. She let out a ragged breath, relaxing her entire body, abandoning the struggle against his superior strength. As he drove the knife down, she simply rotated her hips and dropped her weight. His blade sank deep into the drywall, missing her throat by an inch. Rachel used the opening, driving her knee upward into his groin. As he doubled over with a sharp gasp, she brought her ceramic blade up in a tight, nasty arc, catching him under the armpit, severing the brachial artery. He collapsed against her, his warm blood soaking instantly into her blue scrubs. Rachel pushed his heavy body off her. He hit the floor, thrashing weakly as his blood pressure plummeted to 0. Rachel stood over him, her chest heaving. The room smelled of sweat copper and the burning electrical ozone of the overworked machine. The first man pinned against the MRI was weeping, his ribs shattered. The second was still unconscious. It was over. Slowly, Rachel walked out of the scanning room, leaving the horrors behind the glass. Aaron was still huddled in the corner of the control room, his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. Far in the distance, cutting through the heavy hum of the magnet, the shrill wail of police sirens began to rise in the night air. Rachel looked down at her bloody clothes. She couldn't stay. The police would ask questions. They would run her fingerprints. The people who sent this team would eventually find the police reports. The quiet life she had built was gone completely and irrevocably burned to the ground. She walked over to the supply closet in the corner of the control room and pulled out a fresh set of grey scrub pants and an oversized hospital hoodie. She stripped off her bloody top, not caring that Aaron was in the room, and pulled the clean hoodie over her aching shoulders. She walked past Aaron. She stopped, resting her uninjured hand gently on the young doctor's shaking shoulder. "You did good, doctor," she whispered softly. "Keep him breathing. Tell the cops they were a rival cartel. Don't mention me." Aaron finally opened his eyes, looking up at her in the dim amber light. "Where are you going?" Rachel didn't answer. She turned and walked out the shattered door, stepping over the wreckage, disappearing into the dark, echoing halls of the hospital. She had a long walk ahead of her, and her back was killing her. Thank you for diving into the dark, relentless halls of St. Jude's with Rachel. If this raw, high-stakes medical thriller kept your heart racing, please hit that like button to let the algorithm know. Share this story with fellow adrenaline junkies who appreciate grounded tactical storytelling, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next pulse-pounding episode. Your support keeps these stories alive. Stay safe out there.